Hello, this is Mike Oliver with another SOA Guiding Principle. You want to maximize service usage by considering the current and future scope of utilization. Here are some challenges. Strategic thinking versus tactical thinking. It's probably obvious, but SOA is a strategy. The design and development of a solution is tactical. You want to define the right service domain mix. You want to have services that are all desired to be interoperable, to be included in the same service domain. In other words, your service inventories should be properly organized so that those services that frequently interoperate be included in the same domain. You want to set up those boundaries so that those services that are to be shared only within a domain are not exposed outside the domain. This is for security reasons as well as performance reasons. You want to have those domain services to be interoperable, reusable, and consumable. So setting up those boundaries is a key part of your analysis and design strategy. Seeing into the future. Much harder to do than to say, but of course, when you're talking strategy, you're talking long term. So when you're doing your analysis and your vetting of proposed services and solutions, you need to look a little bit further than just the requirements the business has given you. Is there potential for reuse down the road? Is there potential for cross-domain use? Is there potential for composability of solutions that cross those domain boundaries? You want to define services that capture current utilization requirements, obviously, while having the flexibility to adapt to future changes. Now, there are certain design patterns that will help with that. In other words, you can have a service that you build today that has a facade that deals with the canonical schema for a particular service inventory within a domain, while you can plan for another facade down the road that might be for cross-domain purposes, for composition of that service into other services in another domain. There are other factors to consider. Service granularity. Obviously, you don't want to have too many services that are not reused, that are not shared, that are not composed into other services, and you don't want the overhead of having to deal with the atomic services in a reusable way when they're not reused and never will be. Autonomy. If you have a service that depends on something else, then that service is not autonomous. If it's not autonomous, then it has impact when it's used, and you want to consider that when you're designing the services, especially when you're going to go cross-domain. State management. Sometimes you can't get away from having state management, but there are design patterns that you can use and follow that take that state management and put it into its own service. And that eliminates the wait states of those reusable services. A very key part of performance is eliminating wait states. Scalability. If you don't build your service so that it can be deployed multiple times, then you run into the problem of scaling it within your domain. You want to be able to have both vertical scaling where you add resources and horizontal scaling where you add instances. Composability. Composability has to do with standardized service contracts, shared schemas, the ability to add it in an agnostic way. A service that is not agnostic depends on certain kinds of data, maybe data that's not available except within a certain domain. So that becomes something that is not reusable across domains. Agnostic is about not having dependency on data types. I don't mean the basic data types. I mean things like accounts payable invoice record, or something that is very specific to a particular application. If you're agnostic, you take the same data that is included in that invoice, but you take it as base elements. You don't have to have the source of that data come from the accounts payable system. It's just customer ID, billing amount, inventory items, and so forth. Reusability. Reusability in your design that is looking down the road is probably going to be a strategic effort that you do at the higher level. The standardized service contracts and the canonical schema for a particular service inventory is going to give you the reusability. So if you build the service and you look at it in the long term, building it against that standardized service contract and that canonical schema is going to give you reusability. But if you don't look long term, if you look short term, if you look at just this solution and its requirements, very likely you're not going to build it in a reusable way. One method. Model the big stuff first. Determine the domains and the boundaries. Then within those domains, model your services with an eye on reuse and potential long-term cross-domain. Then, when those domain service inventories, within those domain service inventories, develop a canonical schema and standardized service contract to accommodate those models. That's going to give you the reusability. That's going to give you the composability. Lastly, within each service, within each domain, design against the standardized service contract and canonical schema. With all of the other factors that have been previously listed, that will give you the best usage capabilities and potential usage for your services. Here are some real-world examples. Multiple departments, each with their own IT staff and architects. This happens in large companies, it happens in small companies that merge with other companies, and this is where the lack of a strategy can really be employed. Everybody's heard about silos of information, silos of applications. That's usually because they were developed for a particular set of requirements, maybe for a previous company, and now they've got to figure out how to integrate them. And that's where this idea of looking long-term, having a strategy, is going to pay dividends. I worked with a company that had done several acquisitions, and there was no integration strategy. And so they bought companies, and they had great products, and this was a product company, and they tried to integrate, but because they didn't have that long-term strategy, they ran into many difficulties. And then when they tried to do some additional additions, maybe something that might complement the other products, they couldn't even begin to integrate them because of the lack of the strategy. One domain, a huge staff. I worked with another company that thought that because they only had one domain and they had a large staff, they didn't have to do any strategic thinking. So they never developed any kind of service inventory boundaries or internal domains. They never looked beyond the set of business requirements that they originally had. But over time, things change. And the one domain concept meant that the canonical schema for the one domain was huge. And that led to problems in parsing speed, it led to problems in composability, it led to data model transformations when they weren't necessary, and so forth. Multiple brands, each with their own silos directed by the board to consolidate. Now here is a situation where they merged with several other companies, and they knew that the reason that they were merging was so that they could consolidate and reduce staff, reduce assets, reduce license costs, and so forth. Now here, they actually did the right thing. They said, let's come up with a enterprise strategy. They put together an enterprise architecture team, and they decided that each of these companies had some similar departments and similar requirements and similar processes. So they decided that they would spend the time to do the strategic thinking, come up with the boundaries to each of the domains, and then consolidate within those domains down to a standardized service contract and canonical schema, and eliminated millions of dollars of overhead and redundancy. So, thank you very much. I hope this was beneficial to you. See you on the next guiding principle.